Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Polita Clark. I am a columnist at the Financial Times, and I'm pleased to be here today to chair a discussion on the financial implications of climate change and how they might be addressed. The problem of climate change has, for rather obvious reasons, made far fewer headlines during these disastrous months of the coronavirus crisis, but it hasn't gone away. Just this week, we've seen that Miami has had its hottest week on record. Just over a week ago, a heat wave in Siberia saw temperatures rise to nearly 38 degrees Celsius in June, quite extraordinary. And before that, scientists told us that the month of May was the hottest May we've had on record. So these are all signs of physical risks of climate change that scientists have been warning us about literally for decades. But more recently, investors and central bankers and other authorities have begun to acknowledge there are financial risks posed by both a changing climate itself and efforts to cut carbon emissions. So today we're going to hear arguments about how those efforts might be affected by the pandemic and what that could mean for fossil fuel investments, as well as quite a provocative idea about how regulators might deal with any financial instability caused by climate change. So to discuss this, we have a panel of people with decades of combined experience in the world of climate finance between them. Kingsmill Bond is an energy strategist at Carbon Tracker, which was one of the first think tanks to promote the idea of stranded assets and carbon bubbles. Kingsmill previously worked as a sell-side city analyst, equity analyst and strategist for groups including Citibank and Deutsche Bank, and he's written widely about the energy transition's impact on financial markets. Thierry Philipponnat is a board member at the French Financial Markets Authority and one of the EU's technical experts on sustainable finance. He previously worked for banks as well, including UBS and BNP Paribas, before founding the European NGO Finance Watch in 2011, where he's now head of research and advocacy. And finally, Nick Robbins is Professor in Practice for Sustainable Finance at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Nick previously headed the Climate Change Centre of Excellence at HSBC, and before that, Sustainable and Responsible Investment Funds at Henderson Global Investors. So you will be able to send in questions to our panel once you've heard their thoughts by using the Q&A button that you should be able to see on your screens. But without any more ado, let's kick off with Kingsmill, who I'd like to ask you, Kingsmill, if you could just set out, give us a global overview of how you see the energy transition and how it's affecting the global energy system and what that could mean for financial markets.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Polita. And without any further ado, I will share my screen and my presentation, if that's okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Polita, for having me on this call. I think my role, as you've mentioned, is to set the scene briefly and to show how large and vulnerable the fossil fuel system is, and furthermore to suggest that the decline of that system poses a very significant risk to financial stability. And of course, this is the week in which we've seen a massive $17 billion write-down from BP, followed by new news on further write-downs from Shell today. So I would suggest this extremely timely discussion. So by way of introduction, the first point I want to make is the fossil fuel system is huge, and its size is large enough to mean that its decline causes systemic risk. Fear not, I shan't run through this entire slide, which is quite complex, but what we did, we wrote a piece recently called Decline of Full, where we analyzed the size of the system. And just to summarize that, you've got three key parts. You've got the fossil fuels below the ground, valued by the World Bank at 39 trillion. You've got supply physical infrastructure of 10 trillion, demand physical infrastructure of 22 trillion. And then you have 18 trillion, which is a quarter of global equity markets, and 8 trillion of traded debt, about half of the non-financial corporate debt markets hanging off that. And then in addition to all of that, you have these enormous flows of $1 to $3 trillion a year of economic rents, capex of $4 to $5 trillion a year, and dividends of $1 to $2 trillion a year. So the first point, I guess, is that the system is huge. But actually, that's not all. And since this call is specifically about debt risk, we wanted to draw attention to another point we made in the report, that the untraded debt levels are actually 4 times higher than the traded debt levels, which we have identified. And one problem with untraded debt is that you can't really figure out in detail who's got it, you can infer. And detail from Dealogic and detail from the Rainforest Action Network suggests that syndicated loans have been larger than traded debt issuance, significantly larger for the last 6 years. What that means, therefore, is the implication is the banking sector has a huge amount of debt to the fossil fuel sector, and quite frankly, we don't really know the degree of exposure of one to the other. But I think we can make the argument that the banking sector does not understand the risk properly. So a report by the Network for Greening the Financial System in May 2020, for example, noted, and I quote, that the banks did not distinguish between green and brown exposure. So you have a huge system with a lot of untraded debt linked to the banking sector. This would be fine if business as usual were what's coming. But the problem for the fossil fuel sector is that it is facing a massive technology disruption sped up by policy. And just quickly to outline that argument, which we have made many times at Carbon Tracker, the technology disruption is one where the prices of solar and wind and lithium-ion batteries and green hydrogen and other renewable technologies are falling on these extraordinary learning curves of around 20% for every doubling in capacity, such that 2 things have happened. 2 spectacular changes have happened in the last 5 years. First of all, the cost of this stuff has got lower than the cost of fossil fuels, specifically in electricity, where, for example, Bloomberg Energy Finance calculates that in 85% of the world, the cheapest source of new bulk electricity is renewables. And it's about to happen in the transportation sector too, where $100 per kilowatt hour is the kind of level at which you get a transition which is similar to what's been happening in electricity. So you've got a technology disruption, and that's being sped up, I would suggest, by policy action. Again, a very commonly used graph of how if we do nothing, we're going to get to 4 or 5 degrees. And this is what's driving policymakers, particularly in Europe, to drive down emissions and to drive a much more rapid change in the energy system. And what is most notable in this graph is that regardless if you get to 1.5 or 2 degrees, you have to peak and start declining very, very shortly. And I should also say it's not just carbon emissions which is driving policymakers, also health issues, pollution issues, and energy security, particularly for China and India. So we have a massive system disrupted by very rapid change. And we, as a third point, would argue that we have now entered into a new world of peaking demand. And then I'll conclude on what peaking demand means and why it's so significant and so risky. So if you take, for example, the data from BP that was released a week ago for their 2019 energy demand, 2 or 3 things really stand out from that. First of all, you saw peak fossil fuel demand for electricity already in 2018. So fossil fuel demand for electricity fell by 118 terawatt hours in 2019. You saw that 54% of the growth in total energy demand came from non-fossil sources, primarily solar and wind with some hydro in there. And then thirdly, you see that in 48% of the world, fossil fuel demand is already falling. So right across Europe, North America, South America, Japan, the CIS fossil fuel demand is already falling. So we would argue that we have already seen a series of fossil fuel peaks. So peak coal 7 years ago, peak ICE cars in 2017, potentially peak fossil fuel demand and peak oil demand in 2019, although of course the jury is still out on that. But nevertheless, it's a world of peaking demand throughout the 2020s. So what does peaking demand mean? And this is I guess, the most significant point and why regulators really need to focus on this issue. Peaking demand means overcapacity. Overcapacity means lower prices. And again, this is hardly news in an environment where the price of oil has fallen to minus $20 or $30 and the price of gas is down to $2 or $3. This is what awaits the fossil fuel sector for the foreseeable future. So we try to express that, and there are three areas where peaking demand and falling prices impact incumbents. So the first is you get a massive fall in the rent. So if the price goes from 80 to 40, a lot of that lost rent is lost rent to the petrostates. You then get lower profits right across the system. And then the third disruption is the stranded assets, what we're seeing BP writing down. But it's worthwhile noting that those stranded assets are just one part of the system which is damaged. So the overall impact of this very rapid change and this peaking and this decline in demand, we come back to the original framework that we used. You can see that rents are lower, that capex is lower, that profits are lower, and consequently you have asset consequences, you have lower value of the assets, you get stranded physical infrastructure, and you get lower valuations right across the financial markets. And again, as Carbon Tracker pointed out, you've seen very significant derating of a whole series of sectors from electricity to coal to oil services over the last 10 years. The next question then, before I start to wrap up, Polita, is which parts are most vulnerable? And here, again, the point we wanted to make is that there are two primary vectors which determine vulnerability. The first is, are you building new assets or operating existing ones? Because if you're building new assets, you're a car manufacturer, a gas turbine producer, as GE found out, or you're an oil driller, as Schlumberger found out, you are super vulnerable. And secondly, if you're already getting peaking demand in your space, that's the other core driver of vulnerability. So the way we see the world is that one sector after another of the fossil fuel system is facing peaking demand, and the companies that we've already seen being derated are merely the harbingers of change, which are likely to happen right across the system. So if I conclude on two points, we would suggest that there are very significant consequences of this shift for analysts, which are not yet being factored into financial markets. So analysts need to be factoring in new competition, lower prices, higher taxes, more asset write-downs, and then linked to that, higher discount rates, lower terminal values, higher cleanup costs. And then in the banking sector, they need to be questioning the assumptions the banks are making about their real risks in this new paradigm. So I would suggest that the write-downs we're seeing from Shell and BP in the last 10 days, that's just the start of a whole series of write-downs which are going to be coming across this sector. And the final point then is, what does this mean for policymakers? And I think this call is very much directed to the policy-making fraternity. So as you start to get a green bill back within the context of a structural peak that's that's happening in any event, the risks for the incumbents are particularly intense. And as a result of that, we would suggest that policymakers now need to make sure that they wind down the fossil fuel sector before its collapse threatens the global economy. And Thierry has an extremely brilliant idea about how best to do this. So at this point, I shall conclude the presentation and hand across to him. Thank you.
Just before we do that, can I just pick up a couple of points you've made there? Very interesting analysis, but let me just play devil's advocate for a second. You mentioned Royal Dutch Shell a couple of times, and their news this morning, of course, that they are warning they're going to slash up to $22 billion from the value of their assets, which is about $5 billion more than the asset hit that BP talked about only a couple of weeks ago. But what evidence is there really, Kingsmill, that this is actually a sign of the financial risks that you're talking about? Because surely at a time when the pandemic is driving down energy demand, this would make sense anyway. How can you be sure that they're doing this because they really are worried about the sorts of shifts that you're talking about?
So I think we can be extremely confident about that, because what both Shell and BP are talking about is having lower long-term oil prices. So in fact, it's not so much about the short-term consequences of the virus, but what they've done is they've specifically lowered their long-term oil price. And of course, a lower long-term oil price is the corollary of an environment of falling demand and overcapacity. There is furthermore a saying, as you know, Polita, in financial markets, that the first cut is never the last. And so what's happening is, I think, both in the case of Shell and BP, they've both ratcheted down their expectations of long-term oil prices to levels which, incidentally, we think are too high and are higher than the current levels. And they're likely to continue to have to be ratcheted down over time. I should also say that Carbon Tracker released a very good piece last week looking at the level of long-term oil prices that different oil majors have, and that ranges from Equinor, for example, where it's still $80 to the US companies where they don't even disclose it. So Shell and BP ahead of the curve, but other companies will have to copy them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably come back to this point about peak demand and when it's really likely hit globally later in the discussion. But really, just maybe before we go to Thierry, I mean, you know, if we look at China, which was first into the crisis and has been the first to come out, and we're looking there obviously for lessons, even in the absence of a vaccine for the virus, we're seeing renewed coal-fired investment at quite a pace in some areas there. I mean, isn't it surely arguable that, particularly if we do get a vaccine or a reliable drug to deal with the virus, then we're going to see, you know, your idea of peak demand slipping further and further away into the future?
So perhaps, thank you for the question, because perhaps I should have built up this argument a little bit more, and we've released various pieces of research on this. So the argument really is that you have a structural peak in demand for oil, and indeed right across the fossil fuel complex. And so you have respected forecasters like DNV or McKinsey were already forecasting, or Rystad actually, already forecasting a peak in demand for oil during the course of the 2020s. Furthermore, the COVID shock it brings forward peaks just naturally by a number of years. So the third argument then is simply to say, look, and I'll make the argument for energy as a whole, and then I'll make it for oil, but the energy systems as a whole likely to see a 8% decline in fossil fuel demand in 2020, according to the IEA. You're going to get a bounce back in 2021, but it certainly won't be to the same level as we were in 2019. Nobody really knows, but you've had economic dislocation, you've had all kinds of damage done. You might bounce back half. If you bounce back half, and then the system is still growing at 1% a year as it used to, it's going to take you to 2025 to get back to 2019 levels. By 2025, renewable energy is going to be large enough to take all of the growth in energy demand. And to remind you, in 2019, it was already taking 54%. This is not a theoretical debate. Just to finish, if I may, please, it's not a theoretical debate, because this, of course, is precisely what happened in Europe to fossil fuel demand for electricity generation in 2008. So the crisis of 2008, which brought forward the peak in demand, meant that solar and wind were already taking all of the growth from 2008 when they were only 4% of the system. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just want to move now to Thierry, because at Finance Watch, Thierry, you've just produced a report with the rather arresting title of Breaking the Climate Finance Doom Loop, which is aimed at addressing the problem that's gone through. And I wonder if you can tell us, what exactly do you mean by this doom loop?
Thank you, Pilita. With pleasure. Well, very simply, it is the vicious circle in which fossil fuel finance enables climate change, and climate change threatens financial stability. Finance is the enabler of climate change. It makes it possible. And then in turn, when we're beyond the tipping point, as the community of people looking at this issue like to say, well, climate change will threaten financial stability and will bring that instability that most, if not all, central bankers have recognized now. I mean, the entire central banking community recognizes that climate change will threaten financial stability, and clearly the arguments that Kingsmill just made and the stranded asset, to put it in a broader perspective, even though Kingsmill told us it's not only about stranded assets, but stranded assets is a very, very fundamental issue in which there is, at the end of the day, and it's neither, this is not a moral judgment. This is not, it's good or bad, it's a fact. But, there is no way out of, extracting more value out of the fossil fuel industry in the long term, given climate change. So if we have a threat for financial stability, we have to address it from a risk standpoint.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I agree that obviously we've seen widespread recognition amongst central banks, other regulators, that financial instability needs to, and climate risk needs to be assessed. And we've seen a string of policy measures or suggestions, at least, in the form of stress tests for financial institutions and ever more detailed ideas about climate risk disclosure standards to enhance transparency for investors in the market so that the market will understand how to deal with climate risks. Now, why do we need anything else?
Well, we need something else because the current agenda, whether on so-called climate stress test or on sustainable finance disclosure, will not be sufficient to make a difference. If you allow me, I will elaborate a little bit. On the stress test side, there's a number of things. Those among the central banks who said, okay, we will climate stress test our financial institutions, insurance companies and banks, effectively announced stress tests. And if you read the fine print, they all said a number of weeks later, oh, by the way, it will not be stress test, it will be scenario-based analysis. And why are we, or are they conducting scenario-based analysis as with stress tests? Well, very simply because the actual act of quantifying the impact of climate change is impossible. We're facing a radical uncertainty on the measurement of this phenomenon. And obviously, if you're doing climate stress tests, which, sorry for stating the obvious, should lead to the conclusion of possible capital shortfalls, you need to quantify, and then you say, hey, you need X percent more of capital in order to cope for the risk. But basically they're saying, we don't know how to do that. And it's true that it's impossible, if anything, because the way stress tests are conducted, they're always conducted using data, historical data. By definition, we do not have the data for something that has never happened and that will happen in the future. And there's many other reasons, but this is the most fundamental. So we're facing a paradox where basically supervisors and central banks are saying, we need to measure, the impact of climate change on financial stability, and then we'll take action. And at the same time, they're saying, oh, by the way, we cannot measure it. Okay,
all right. So what's your plan is very interesting, I think. You basically have an idea that existing regulation would allow regulators to essentially increase the risk weightings that banks need to apply to their oil, gas and coal exposure. So just to explain briefly how that would work both for existing activities and future ones.
Yeah, with pleasure. Fundamentally, we look at the issue, sorry for repeating myself, but this is absolutely fundamental from a risk standpoint, which is why we think prudential regulation is the right tool to address the issue. And then we ask ourselves, okay, we cannot quantify, as I just said, so what can we do? Should we do nothing? No, we don't have the luxury of doing nothing. So what should we do? We should look at it from a qualitative point of view. So we look into the banking prudential regulation, okay, the Basel III framework, which in the EU environment is called capital requirements regulation. And it bears other names in other jurisdictions, but it's the Basel III framework. And we ask ourselves whether the risk weights, and our report is focused on the EU regulation, but can be exported to other legislative jurisdictions. We ask ourselves whether from a qualitative standpoint, the current risk weights applied to fossil fuel exposures are coherent. So we're looking for coherence in the regulation. And we first look at existing exposures to fossil fuel. And we see that...
So just to be clear, that could be, for example, a loan to a coal miner.
Absolutely, an existing loan to a coal miner or to an oil rig or to, any oil and gas company. So, and we look at the regulation and we see that currently it applies a risk weight of 100% on that exposure. And then we find an article, the number of the article doesn't really matter, it's Article 128 of Capital Requirements Regulation that says, oh, by the way, if an exposure is particularly risky or unpredictable, you should put a weight of 150%. And then, very stupidly, I was going to say, we just read, carbon trackers reports and we say, is there a high risk on this? And our answer is yes. Is it highly unpredictable? Well, in the very best of cases, it is. And therefore, we're saying, from a coherence point of view, this capital requirements regulation should apply a risk weight of 150% just for the sake of consistency within the regulation. And then we ask ourselves, okay, then there's going to be the new exposures that are going to add even more carbon emissions in a context where the carbon budget of the planet is between 10 and 15 years. And we're saying this is actually enabling the acceleration of climate change. So we say, okay, there's a double consequence to this. First of all, from a micro-prudential standpoint, those new exposures, given the time it takes to explore, extract, exploit, when on existing exposure, you have a high likelihood of a significant loss, on future exposure, you have an almost certainty of a complete loss. And if you have certainty of a complete loss, then that exposure should be entirely equity funded. And then we look at it from a macro-prudential standpoint. And from a macro-prudential standpoint,
so just to be clear there, when you say equity funded, you're meaning basically that the people would understand that it was a very risky venture and the risk would be borne by the equity funders.
Absolutely, and that means that when banks lend to those new for financing those new fossil fuel exposures, they should lend out of their equity, 100% out of their equity, as opposed to leveraging on the business, which is the usual way of doing business when you're a bank. But if you have the certainty of losing the money, obviously you don't want to be leveraged. I mean, for obvious reasons. So what we're saying here is that from a macro-prudential standpoint, say I'm a macro-prudential regulator, I cannot afford to see an activity feeding, enabling what will be tomorrow's disaster. And therefore, I need to do something about this. And this is why we come up with a risk weight of, nominally it sounds very high, but we need to understand why it is so, of 1,250%. And why is that so? Because in the capital requirement logic and the Basel III logic, banks have to set aside 8% capital, vis-a-vis their exposures, and 8% of 1,250 is 1. So therefore, if you want complete equity funding or 100% equity funding, you need to put a risk weight of 1,250%. So we're saying existing exposures make it coherent with the rest of CRR. New exposures, the risk is so high, it has to be entirely equity funded, which, by the way, is nothing revolutionary because CRR already considers the case of a number of exposures, including, for instance, holding companies. It's not something very exotic that needs to be funded. I mean, that carry a risk weight of 1,250%. So we're not offering at all something that has never been seen in the landscape.
Right. But nonetheless, I mean, would it not mean then that the ultimate ramification of this is that for the bank, it would become incredibly expensive to offer loans to either fossil fuel companies for existing ventures and almost impossible for future ones. And so therefore, at a time of a global crisis, a pandemic, wouldn't the companies themselves and possibly even the banks turn around and say, look, we're being choked, we're having our financing choked off, therefore we can't do this or that venture, therefore that's going to have a terrible impact on jobs?
Pelisa, you're asking perhaps the most important question, so thank you for this. I would like to return the question, because, you know, if you go one step further in the logic you just summarized, if we keep the system as it is today, it means that fundamentally we're subsidizing, we're giving a favorable treatment to fossil fuel exposure. What I'm saying here is that if the price for keeping the game going is not to recognize the actual risk carried by fossil fuel exposures, then as an analyst looking at prudential regulation, I have a problem, because basically what the argument you just summarized is telling me is that, oh, please underestimate the risks so that I can keep on doing business. And I do not believe that, you know, prudential regulation, and we at Finance Watch do not believe that prudential regulation should underestimate a risk for the sake of keeping a business going. If a risk is estimated at X, it should be, you know, it should carry a risk weight, you know, related to X. And this is absolutely fundamental.
Okay. Well, I want to turn to Nick Robbins now. So Nick, you're happily now in the halls of academe, but I'd like to ask you to cast your mind back to when you were at HSBC and think about what might have happened if someone came into your office one day and said, well, there's this group called Finance Watch, and they seem to have somebody on the French market regulator behind them, and they've come up with this report suggesting that risk weightings have to be dramatically increased anytime we make a loan to a coal, oil or gas company. What would your advice to them have been, and how do you think they would have reacted to a proposal like this?
Well, thank you, Polita. Thanks very much to the presentations. I think if you put the two presentations together, you've got a very, very powerful analytic case that we're going to need to see sort of systemic change to deal with both the climate risk and the consequential energy system risk. So I think one of the things is actually this requires a change in expectations, and particularly moving from a sort of recognition of risk, which I think you said out at the beginning, people recognize climate change and so on, to a fundamental repricing of that risk, which is why I think one of the proposals that Thierry presented is so powerful. So I think if we look through the financial system, and maybe I'll get to the banks, but firstly, this is an issue for finance ministers, and Kingsmill touched on that. But particularly, what does this mean for your fiscal position, particularly if you're in fossil fuel states, your carbon entanglement and so on? What does this mean now for your recovery plans and so on? And we know we have a fundamental market failure and carbon is not priced. This is the time to put in carbon pricing right now. Then we have central banks, and Thierry touched on this, but I think we're now in a phase of recognizing the extreme costs that we could be facing if we let climate change get underway. This week, the NGFS scenario is suggesting we'll have about a 25% overall loss in GDP with climate impacts and physical impacts. The analysis, if you go at the poorest 40% of the world, it's 75%. So if you're talking about the Indias, the Africa, and so on, this is simply catastrophic. However, the models we have do not actually probably measure the most important things. They do not measure and include extreme risks. They do not measure sea level rise. They do not measure the impacts of migration or indeed conflict. So some of these, so actually the measures we have of risk are probably quite profound underestimates. So I think if we look at those, we get then the analytical case, this involves system change. And I think increasingly central banks at the macro-prudential level, as Thierry is saying, need to start understanding which assets in the system are stability enhancing and which are stability degrading. And we clearly, I think, can see fossil fuel assets as stability degrading. They're degrading the financial stability of the system, which is their job to look at. I think the case that Thierry has put for the adjustments, particularly on the precautionary principle as part of the EU law, is very compelling. And I think particularly thinking about high risk assets you already have, and signaling that future assets as well obviously do carry these risks. Maybe just an extension of what Thierry was saying. that leads to the idea that this should be focused on equity finance, if that's going to come through for new fossil fuels. And that obviously means there are consequences of other parts of the financial system in terms of capital markets, in terms of pension funds, insurance companies, and so on. So actually those areas as well. So I think in a sense, the analysis that we start off with from Kingsmill, and then the particular regulatory proposals we had from Thierry, I think would be increasingly recognized by leading bankers and investors as probably the necessary consequences of where we are.
Yeah,
obviously,
let me just pick up a word you used there. When you and I've used that word recognized.
Yeah.
And can I put it to you, and in fact also to Thierry and Kingsmill afterwards, that when we look back at the last 4 or 5 years of really quite intense activity in terms of people and regulators talking about, thinking about, proposing greater disclosure standards and stress testing and whatnot. If we look at just at disclosure, in other words, regulation that's designed to come up with uniform ways in which investors can push companies to disclose risk, and indeed not just investors but regulators. If we look at that, we look out there at the world as it is today, it's taken a huge amount of time not just to formulate those standards, but the idea that they'll be mandatory in any meaningful number of countries around the world is still quite difficult for me to imagine. So I guess I'm asking you, Nick, from your background, and then Kingsmill and Thierry, if it's taken that long to get something like mandatory disclosure standards, what hope is there for an idea like this, which I would suggest would be very quickly and heatedly opposed by banks?
Well, this month, 28 years ago, I was working at the European Commission and negotiating Agenda 21 in Rio de Janeiro. And that actually had a requirement in it that companies should report on their environmental impacts 28 years ago. And I agree with you that actually disclosure is absolutely essential. But I think if we're going to wait before we get perfect standards on disclosure, or indeed perfect disclosures, we're going to have problems in terms of actually very, very immediate energy transition risk, which Kingsmill said, or the build-up of longer-term climate risk. So I think we need to have a twin-track approach. Certainly press for tighter disclosures and so on, which is happening very, very well. But alongside that, I think we can take the precautionary approach where we do know that there are very, very clear risks. And I think with fossil fuels, particularly with coal, we know that. We need actually very little extra disclosure. When I was at HSBC and we did the first analysis of stranding risks for coal, and I think it was 2012, we use no corporate disclosure. You don't actually need it to understand actually the risk. For more complex sectors you do, but actually I think we can actually start taking a twin track approach, improve disclosures, improve stress testing, but where there is a very, very clear case, I think particularly with coal financing, then the precautionary principle I think you can apply. And Thierry has set that out in his report.
Okay, well, just before we go to questions, of which there are quite a few, let me ask you, Thierry, first. I guess it's that. Let me frame that question again. It's taken so long to see any sign of mandatory disclosure. Why do you think there's any hope that your ideas of increasing risk weighting would be able to proceed even in normal times at a pace required?
Well, there are two reasons for this. The first one is you saying the banks are going to be opposing this. We will see. I mean, basically what we're saying is that we need banks and we want them to be up and running when climate change strikes. And if they're not properly capitalized on their exposures to fossil fuel, they will have a problem and we will all collectively have a problem. So if they oppose this, that means that they clearly put more weight on tomorrow morning's profits than on their sustainability with a 10 or 20 years time horizon, which is not that long. I mean, do they want to be still up and running in 10 and 20 years time? And frankly, when I see the recent announcement by Shell and BP, they're going to have a hard time explaining that the current risk weights in the prudential regulation reflects the actual risks. I mean, you know, it's, you know, you just have to read the press. That's one thing. The other thing, there's an institutional reason why we think it's feasible, because as Nick referred to, we explained that basically EU legislation has everything ready to put this in place. It's just a case of pushing the button by policymakers. You know, with Article 191 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union that sets the precautionary principle that says if a risk is not addressed, you have to address it. It's not you may if you wish, you have to. And then you go into prudential regulation, and there is an Article 459 which says the European Commission has the power, if a risk is not addressed, to literally push the button and put in place the necessary capital requirements that will tackle the issue. And then there is very simply reforming the capital requirements regulation, which could take a year, year and a half, and then you have a year or two of implementation. So it could be in place, say, 3 years from now. And in meanwhile, as the Commission has the power to act today, now, without waiting, you know, we can have this in place in a few months' time if we want. So the report explains why it's important. We've gone through that. I'm not starting again, but how it can be made. And so that, you know, it's just a case of doing it. And that means that if policymakers do not do it, it will be a political choice not to do it.
Okay. I mean, I'd like to ask you actually if you've had any feedback at all from any policymakers in Brussels, but do feel free to tell us if you'd like to. But
well, of course, I mean, it's part of our job. We're having discussions with many policymakers, you know, in the 3 EU institutions. We know who they are. And, you know, there's a great interest in the arguments. And of course, it takes time. The report was released 3 weeks ago. So, you know, you need to take the time to think properly and weigh out all the arguments and everything. But, you know, the unanimous reaction so far is, we have to think about it, and we need to keep on discussing.
Okay, Kingsmill, just quickly, the same question to you is, you know, what are the real world possibilities of an idea like this really taking off?
Well, first of all, again, I salute Yahi for having figured out the specific article and thing that needs to be changed and approaching all of the right people. The reason why they need to act is because this is for real. So
well, I'm not asking you why they need to act. I'm asking you to think back to when you were working for a bank and talk about how real, you know, what sort of reception would an idea like this realistically get inside a bank?
Well, actually, a very good one, because if you go to a banker and you say, "There's this real risk. There's a cliff, and you're about to drive over it. You need to turn to the left, or at the very least, you need to increase the risk weighting you're placing upon the drivers heading towards that cliff," they'd be very happy to understand that. And I think that's the only point we're trying to make here, is that this is a real world risk and it's not being factored in accurately or correctly. And people who do so are going to benefit, and those who fail to do so are going to lose money. And this brings me back, I guess, to the further point. The big difference in this energy transition sort of now versus 4 or 5 years ago is that rather than having to push water uphill, which is what Nick was trying to do 25 years ago, back in Rio, it was very, very hard because the economics were not in favor. Now, actually, policymakers, I hate to say it, are behind the curve, and the economics are excellent. They just have to channel the water downhill, so it's considerably easier than it was before.
Yeah. Let's go to questions. And the first one that was received is a very good one, I think. It's from someone who says that they are basically very supportive of the idea of linking financial activities and regulatory action to the energy transition, but they ask about, you know, this is something that can obviously happen with commercial banks and listed fossil fuel companies. What about the nationalized companies that exist in China, India, and elsewhere, not to mention the national oil companies of the Middle East and elsewhere? How do you all suggest that the assets and regulations be changed in these countries?
Well, if I may, yeah, whether the companies are listed or not is a different topic from the fact that, you know, the financing provided to them, you should carry a certain risk weight that we just debated. What this question is saying, and it's perfectly founded, is that the issue is much broader. You know, I'm sitting in Brussels right now, but the issue is much broader than the EU. This is a global issue. So the issue has to be taken to Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, BCBS, to the Financial Stability Board, FSB, and we need to discuss this globally so that, you know, all finance provided to fossil fuel companies should carry the same sort of weight. And it's absolutely fundamental. There was a very good rainforest action report published more or less a year ago called Banking on Climate Change that showed that out of the $2.7 trillion of bank lending provided to the fossil fuel industry in the 4 years following the Paris Agreement, 11 out of the 35 banks that provided that funding were EU banks. That means the remaining 24 are non-EU, and they are basically American, Japanese, Chinese, Canadian, British, and Swiss. So this is a much broader issue than pure EU, of course, and it needs to be taken globally.
Right.
Can I add to that? I mean,
sure.
yesterday we were actually at another of these fantastic Zoom events with Dr. Ma Jun, who's the advisor to the People's Bank of China. And this was discussing actually a recent report we've released setting out a toolbox for central banks to align their crisis response measures to COVID with climate action. And as many of you know, very few central banks have actually linked the two as yet. And I think the question is absolutely right, that actually we're going to win or lose, particularly the climate battle in the sort of billion population countries of China and India. Ma Jun on the Chinese side was very clear that the disclosure is coming and is going to be mandatory. And I think there is potentially more openness, maybe not on the particular prudential measures that Thierry said, but more openness, I think, on aligning some of the central bank monetary tools, so green financing tools and so on, with green finance and in the West. So I think China would be a good place to start. And obviously China is a sort of co-founder of this network for green financial system. India, the Reserve Bank of India is starting, I think, to recognize these issues. There's some interesting signs coming through recently. And if you look at the risks, the climate risks facing India, it is the most exposed large country in terms of climate risks. Obviously already has water stress and is a poor country, so resilience is very low. So I again, and Kingsmill will give more details, but again, the case, the strategic economic case for action in India is very, very powerful, not least because they import so much of their fossil fuel energy. So I think I would expect to see a stepping up of action in India in the coming year.
Yeah. Let's go to another question, and Kingsmill, I'm going to ask you to address this first. This is from someone who says, the spreads on oil and gas majors' long-term bond markets do not signal distress, but the investors are looking at the same data as you. Why do you think they're so relatively relaxed?
Well, this is precisely why we are working with a number of hedge funds, which in this situation see the same kind of opportunity as Michael Lewis identified in The Big Short 10 years ago, and are actively out there shorting the bonds of these companies in the expectation that market participants will change their views. And I should say that we at Carbon Track have been making this argument about the fundamental fragility of the fossil fuel system for about 10 years now. And for 10 years, it's been significantly underperforming the rest of the market in the equity markets. And so it has actually been an extremely good bet to bet against the continuity of this system. And I suspect that as a realization shifts from the equity markets into the bond markets, you will have an opportunity to make spectacular fortunes by shorting the long bonds of these stocks.
Very good. Well, that's an encouraging thought for some. Thierry, what do you think? What would your response to that be?
I think there is a natural, I mean, you know, investors are very much, I mean, they're taken between two conflicting trends. One is the fundamentals of companies, you know, and understanding fundamentals, and what Carbon Tracker in this particular instance is doing is trying to think about, okay, what are the fundamentals and what implication does that have? But we also know that financial markets are following a number of other factors, including a number of very short-term factors, including the fact that, you know, they cannot decorrelate themselves too much from their benchmarks, including, you know, there's many constraints they have, including short-term performance, that, you know, the paradox on this climate change impact on financial asset debate is that basically a lot of investors think that as capital markets provide liquidity, they will always have the ability to get away with it and to disinvest if they're long or whatever, or go short if they can and want to go short, you know, before disaster strikes. And it's not a surprise. It's not my job as financial advisor clearly to speak to investors on a daily basis. But I found very interesting in what Kingsmill just said, that, you know, the people actually going for that, you know, in a pursuit of profit are hedge funds, which are not following the classical rules of capital market investments. There are different animals, as we know. So, you know, that reflects, you know, the two big trends of financial markets, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got quite a few other questions. Let's try to get through a few more. Here's one from someone asking, how can we further this proposal in the context of COP26 being the next round of global climate talks, was due to be held in November this year in this country. Now it's been put off for a year. Nick, you've worked at the UN or with the UN. Is it feasible to think about an idea like this increase in risk weighting to be thrown into that heady mix of global climate negotiations? Does it need to be?
I think so. I mean, clearly finance will be a major track of COP26, not least because of the COVID crisis. So we're going to need to see a lot focused on the recovery plan, and maybe something will come up later, particularly around employment and just transition issues, but also central banks will be key to that. Mark Carney has laid out sort of some of his ideas in terms of sort of the importance of reporting, risk, as we've been discussing, and also returns. And my sense, certainly from talking to sort of central bank leaders, is they're much happier talking about action within their mandates on the basis of risk, as we've been talking about today. So I think the reception of ideas which do address in a very, very pragmatic way the risk that is now coming through on particular assets, on fossil fuel assets, I think could be part of that. And I think what we'd be looking at over the next year or so is particular individual central banks or groups of central banks, particularly obviously the Euro system, taking some steps suggesting that actually the next phase of central bank action is obviously to include better disclosure, as we've been seeing, the stress tests, but taking particular action on particular risk weights as well. So I think this could well be part of the agenda.
Okay, there's another question here asking you all what you think about a carbon tax. And let me just elaborate on it for a second. At the moment, we've got an average global carbon price of somewhere around $2 a tonne. In other words, far too low to do anything meaningful. If we were to think about an idea like this one of increasing risk weightings actually coming to pass, and in other words, if you were able to limit financing for fossil fuel investments in commercial banks, essentially, how would that compare with the introduction of a meaningful carbon price? In other words, wouldn't you still require a carbon price to cover other aspects of the economy, and perhaps not, you think that you wouldn't require such a high carbon price? I wonder if anyone would like to address that.
Yeah, if I may start, I think this is very complementary, and it's not only about the pleasure of the intellectual debate, but the proposal we're making is really, as you just summarized, a risk debate. You know, what's the risk? What do we do to address the risk? once you've done that, you haven't said, orient the capital in this direction or in that direction. And doing that comes down to economic policy. And carbon price is really economic policy. And the two are complementary, but they are different tracks. So I think it's complementary and one doesn't exclude the other. And it's actually slightly different, but as I said, complementary.
Yeah. Unless anybody else is desperate to talk, we've only got a few minutes left. Kingsmill, you've got your mouth open there.
No, that's fine. I love talking about carbon tax. But Thierry's right, of course, but the very observation that carbon taxes are incredibly low, we pay $2 or $3 per ton, and we should be paying 100, and people are finally waking up to this, means that therefore the risk is going to increase. And therefore you've got to put a higher risk factor on the people who are producing the carbon. I mean, as Thierry says, it's extremely, this all ties up, it all adds up. You don't need to have one or the other, they link. Okay.
This is an interesting question, actually, that goes to, is asking for a little more detailed thought, I think, on this idea of risk weightings. And the question is asking, what's the position on risk weightings of fossil fuel generation that's less profitable, required for baseload electricity, for example, a peaking gas plant, a gas peaking plant? Would you project having lower risk weightings for those plants versus coal, for example? Or do you think, no, it just has to be a flat, say, 150 or 1250% increase?
Certainly our view is a flat 150 or 1250, depending on new or existing, for the simple reason that, sorry for stating the obvious, but CO2 emissions come from fossil fuel exploitation and use. And therefore, I think this is no time to refine until the end of time. This is not, because the minute you open this debate, I mean, we go back to what you're saying, Pilita. I mean, the debate is going to go on and on and on and on for years. And then natural private interests will emerge saying, hey, I'm less CO2 intensive, or I'm less profitable, therefore or I'm less risky, so put a lower risk weight. I mean, if we start doing this, we're losing sight of the big picture. So in our view, it's not the thing to do.
Yeah. Anybody else like to weigh in on that? If you have any thought? I mean, Nick, I would have thought that, policymakers would really be under a lot of pressure to make the sort of distinction that Thierry's just suggested would be problematic.
But again, I think the clarity and simplicity is very important here. And again, it'll be up to the proposers of that particular asset, if they can generate more returns and therefore justify the risk weight. Well, that's going to be left up to the market. But I think actually having sort of very, very specific risk weights would actually make it incredibly complicated. So I think a simplicity here would be very important, because I mean, we're trying to avoid deep disruption to markets and societies, and I think a clarity of signal is important.
Yeah. Well, on that point of simplicity and clarity, we have unfortunately reached the precise time of 2:30 in London, so regretfully I'm going to say that we have to close there, but let me say thank you to all of you for an extremely interesting discussion. I'm sorry we weren't able to get through everybody's questions. There were a number of terrifically interesting ones. It seems to me there's a huge amount of interest out there in not just the reports that Kingsmill and Thierry have put forward, but in trying to grapple with how we actually deal with these issues in a physical and of course financial context. So thank you very much, all of you, for a terrific discussion, and thanks to Finance Watch and Carbon Tracker for making today's event possible. And with that, I shall say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.